Good morning and welcome to the Back to School episode of Move and Bloom. Hi, I'm Anna Maria and I'm super excited to have with me today Christine Labbe, an Anat Baniel Method pediatric practitioner. Christine's also a conscious parenting and empowerment coach. Christine was inspired to get this and many other certifications in her own journey with her daughter who lives with Atypical Rett Syndrome. Christine's multidisciplinary practice supports children living with special needs and their families all around the world. I'm super excited to hear about Christine's upcoming new projects, and I bet you will be too. So without further ado, welcome, Christine. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us your story.
So where does my story begin? As you mentioned, I have a daughter who has atypical Rett syndrome. And I think that's kind of where the major transformation really began for our entire family. The early stages were a bit challenging. I think a lot of parents experience that. It's a moment of worry, a moment of fear, a moment where all of our wounds are just brought up to the surface all at once. And it's hard to navigate all of those feelings. At the same time, we're really trying to show up for our child and do everything we can. And so after a few months of doing the traditional form of therapy, we eventually began to notice that it wasn't quite effective for Gabby. And we started exploring alternative modalities. And I was lucky enough to fall on the book, The Brain's Way of Healing, and also Anat's book, which was absolutely eye-opening. In that moment, I just knew my daughter needs to see this woman. She has to see her. So we went to San Francisco and Gabby got some intensives there. So she met a few of the practitioners out there and we saw so much magnificent change. I knew that this was going to become part of her journey. Mm-hmm. And so knowing that this was going to become a monthly occurrence, Michelle Vine and Neil, who are practitioners in San Francisco, told me there was a program that was beginning to become a practitioner so that I could help her myself. And that's kind of where that journey began, where I started, rediscovering myself. Many parents take this training and we think we're doing this for our child. We want to be able to help our child, and we don't realize how transformative it is for the parent. And I think this kind of ties into what I was saying at the beginning when I said, in those early stages, there are so many feelings coming up for the parents, and we don't quite know how to process them, deconstruct them. So we kind of choose to suppress. Yeah. And then through the ABM training, everything just kind of comes up to the surface for healing. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my journey towards ABM, and then all of the transformation that occurred afterwards. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into.
Well, you've already given me so much just to unpack. Let me process for a minute, because you said a lot of important things. And the one that comes to mind right away is how transformative this work can be for everyone involved. And I'm going to tie that back to what you said right at the beginning, which is that when suddenly your life changes, this is me putting in my own words, when suddenly your life changes, there is a lot happening, not just for your loved one, but for yourself as both an individual and as a parent and as a family member and as a community member. So there's just so much that needs to happen, that I was wondering if you could speak more about how this modality offers us a framework to transform at all those levels, right?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I tell families is sometimes to do that deeper healing, and I'm going to get to why ABM is a wonderful modality for that. sometimes to get to that deeper healing, we need to go through different types of modalities, not necessarily talk therapy, right? People often assume when we're talking about healing that, especially when it's emotional, that we should go see a psychologist, or we should go see, a coach or a counselor, whatever it may be. But the truth is that a beautiful combination of different modalities can be really powerful for parents. And ABM is something that I find incredibly powerful, because parents, and I'm saying adults generally, as people, we lose ourselves when we grow into adults, right? And this is a deeper conversation, but we lose ourselves to become what the external world wants us to be. And so in many ways, when we have our child with special needs, all of our insecurities, our self-worth, all of those things come up to the surface to actually help us get back to that authentic version of ourselves, right? But in order to get to that deeper healing, sometimes going through a training or simply exploring ABM as a modality can be very powerful in reconnecting with yourself on a deep level, because we're reconnecting with our body in movement, but the movements are so subtle that you're really beginning to learn how to feel. And I think a lot of us forget how to feel, or we choose not to feel because it's too painful. However, in order to heal, we have to feel the pain and move through it, right? So ABM kind of helps us do that in such a beautiful, gentle way, where we start to reconnect with ourselves, and we don't even realize that as we're moving along, releasing, because sometimes it can happen to cry after an ABM session, because we're simply releasing all of those suppressed emotions that we've been carrying for so long. So it's a beautiful way actually to reconnect with ourselves, become reacquainted with who we are, so we can start to understand how our outer world then needs to change when we really know who we are. I feel like as a parent, I discovered after the training that, my life really didn't align with who I was, because I simply didn't know who I was before the training.
Right. Yeah. And
right?
It's interesting that you say that it's about feeling, because one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, because memories can come up as you're moving and sensing. And the way I'll put it, and someone would put it differently, is that things that were previously just cognitive, because the adult world sort of pushes us into thinking through that lens primarily, if not only, things that were previously only cognitive then become more three-dimensional, more real, with more of a felt sense, right? So now when I access memories, I'm not accessing my thoughts about the memory, I'm actually accessing the memory. And it can be a great memory, or it can be a memory that I haven't worked with yet and might bring tears. But it really then becomes a tool for figuring out what I think about something, because I'm not going to stop thinking cognitively about something. But if I add to that my very real felt sense, it brings a richness to it that allows me to be, as you say, my authentic self. So I really love your unique take on this. And I'm wondering how then you proceeded to change your life. You said that your authentic self and your life weren't matching up. What happened?
Well, many things happened, without going into too many details, but, my whole life did transform. I mean, my friends began to change. My career changed, completely transformed, right? I mean, I think that's a big one, is that I completely left this old world, that, this old career that really wasn't aligned with my heart, and then built a business to work with children with special needs. And, that kind of turned into something bigger. I eventually built a team of different practitioners to support families, and then started coaching parents. I mean, this has just opened up this whole new world, but it really aligns with my heart. And I think this is where we start to feel, as you said, we really start to feel what is aligned, what feels right. This is where, that inner channel, that intuition, sometimes it gets disconnected, right? Exactly. And I feel ABM really helps us open that channel again. And it helps us get to that deeper healing, which is what kind of led me to the conscious parenting coaching afterwards, you know, to add that deeper layer of healing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have so many questions about that. So how do you interweave the conscious parenting and the ABM? What might that look like for a family coming to you?
So conscious parenting is very much aligned with ABM. I mean, if you think of ABM, we're told it's all about connecting, not fixing, right? All about flexible goals, about going slowly. You know, all of these elements are really important, and they're completely part of the approach in conscious parenting. Conscious parenting is all about learning with your child. So you're, in essence, reparenting yourself so that you're not passing on your own wounds, your own insecurities and fears and all of this onto your children, right? But when you go through that transformation, that's when you're more able to apply connection. So a deep, meaningful, authentic connection when you're really connecting soul to soul, heart to heart. I think this is something people don't quite understand, is what does that really mean? You know, we might think that we're connecting with another human being, but connecting with someone is energetic. It's energetic, right? It's really how you're showing up, your presence.
Yeah.
And it's all about seeing, hearing, and valuing another human being, right? So that connection, understanding what does that connection truly mean? You know, it's one thing to say connecting versus fixing, but what is connecting? And I think that's where it adds that richness, is to really discover, you know, what that connection means. And I think this goes beyond the parents, right? It's the parents connecting with the child, but also practitioners connecting with the children. And I think this is one of the things that I love about ABM practitioners, is because we're learning how to feel deeply. That possibility for authentic connection, it's present for us. Whereas for other modalities, if they're not doing that kind of transformation within themselves, you know, in the context of their training, if they're not able to feel on that level, that connection is going to be a lot more difficult. So I think that's one of the beautiful elements of ABM, right?
Yeah.
But it's also, you know, those flexible goals, just really understanding your child, flowing with your child. So, and that's within the context of seeing. So really being able to see your child, know who they are, you know, observe them with curiosity and love, not judgment. So it's all of these different elements where we start to shift into that connection versus the fixing, but with those flexible goals. So not coming in with an agenda, you know, not coming in with, you know, specific outcomes in mind. It's really about, this is where my child is, and these are all of their beautiful qualities, and really having that capacity to see those qualities that are outside the box, you know, because a lot of our differently abled children will emanate all these wonderful qualities and gifts, but we have to have the capacity to see them, right?
Absolutely.
And then once we can see them, we can then guide those children towards whatever their innate potential is. But it requires us to see it. And I think this is the beautiful thing with ABM practitioners, and also for parents who choose to do that deeper healing, because as we see ourselves more authentically, we're more able to see the child.
Yes, absolutely. And
right?
It's the beautiful thing, and it's the frustrating thing, because once you've gotten a taste of that, once you begin to live that way, to then interface with other systems that don't hold those beliefs can be really challenging. And one of those places that comes up for a lot of people is school. Can you speak to that perhaps?
Yes, interestingly enough, I had a conversation with a parent this week about that. And I think it's really important. And I mean, I'm going to speak freely and honestly, right? Yeah. It is true that the education system isn't always aligned with this approach that we're speaking of, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes children are imposed certain limitations, especially differently abled children, because they're kind of put in a box. Mm-hmm. So we're not really giving them that opportunity to discover what their innate potential is, to express those beautiful gifts and abilities, because it requires educators to have that ability to be able to see those things, right? And they have many children. So I think, how does it tie into the school system? I think it ties in with the parents.
Okay.
And I think this comes back to advocating.
Mm-hmm.
So for parents to be empowered to advocate for their children in the context of the school system. I mean, surely, ABM practitioners could go in and teach the staff different things, or you could have conscious parenting coaches going in and teaching the staff different things. And educators are very open to that. Some are, some aren't, but most of the time they're open to these things if they're able to implement. They're able to implement. And I would say it also depends on that educator's capacity to feel, right? That educator's capacity to really see, hear, and value the children, because those children need to be heard. And I think this is something that I am going to speak to because, and this is in every context in the school as well, and this is also to inform parents, is that our children have boundaries. You know how difficult it is for us to set boundaries for ourselves. It's so important to teach our children that we hear them, that we hear when they have boundaries, that we hear when they simply don't want to do something, that we don't push them to do things. And I think within the education system, it's really, really important to prioritize their self-worth. And I think that's not prioritized, especially for our differently abled children.
Especially.
Right? And so this is where I always bring up the seeing, hearing, valuing, because we really want them to feel like we truly see their magnificence. And it's very difficult to do that in the school system right now, because there are all these expectations, right, for the child, and that child is being imposed a curriculum or whatever it may be, and that curriculum may not really fit into what that child's meant to be or do. It's not necessarily really aligned. And so it turns into this experience of a lot of not being good enough, right? And that's kind of what our children experience. So I think going back to how do we empower the parents, going back to the advocating. When the parents really, really see their kids, they really understand their child, they really know what those beautiful gifts are, they really understand how to guide the people in their child's environment to help the child express that innate potential. I think that's where the parents' power is, in being able to communicate that to the educators, but also being able to identify, is this educator going to have a positive impact on my child? And, this is an important topic to talk about. The environment for the child, especially for differently abled children, is so, so important. That it's positive and that it really, really prioritizes building the child from the inside out, not from the outside in, which right now it's really that outside in approach, but their inner world gets destroyed as a result, right? So it's really to build that confidence.
And I want to point out, to be fair, because I agree with everything you're saying, to be fair, we can only do what we know how to do. And in my experience, in most educational systems, the teachers know one way because that is either what they experience or what they've been taught to do. And they don't have any real felt sense of how it could be different. So what you're talking about, and I'm going to put my own words on it, is offering them the possibility that there is another way and that it's okay to change their lenses, right? Because the traditional lenses say that kids are broken, that, well, they can't because X or Y, right? Whereas we can offer the possibility of changing lenses to, this is what is wonderful about my child. And these are all the opportunities that you have, right? So what have you found in your experience, or perhaps in some of your clients' experiments, just a little tiny thing that might help educators just begin to change those lenses?
You know, I would give the same advice to educators, therapists, or parents. I really feel like it comes back to working on ourselves, because our lens cannot change. We cannot change the lens through which we see others if we don't change the lens through which we see ourselves. So I think this is where, you know, we can't ask the whole world to do their own personal work, right? We simply can't. However, as parents, we can choose who we want to have part of our child's life. And I think this is where we can decide, is this educator going to be a good fit for my child or not? Is this going to have a good impact, a good positive, rich impact on their self-worth or not? You know, for educators, I think there are ways that we can coach them. There are programs that can be offered, but perhaps not in the way that you would think. You know, it would be a combination of healing for themselves, shifting their own perspective, shifting their own conditioning, you know, moving away from certain belief systems that were imposed on them in the first place, and then actually allowing them to connect more with their own truth and feelings so that they can really start to show up for those kids in a different way. You know, there is no one size fits all. There is a size that's going to fit for that particular group of children, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's no straight answer for you, but there are certainly different ways. And I think this is happening, is there are different groups like conscious parenting coaches, or even some projects within NeuroMovement where they're going into the school system and teaching, right? Teaching staff how to bring the work into the classroom. So I think there are different possibilities out there. It's more a matter of which school system is going to be open. And then, you know, once we get certain groups involved and we get things moving, then we can do it on a larger scale.
Right. And, you know, personally, I have found, and perhaps you can tell me what your experience has been, that if in my interactions with others, I model the 9 essentials, which we haven't introduced in this interview with people perhaps you might want to talk about, but if we model the 9 essentials in our interactions with others, it begins to rub off on them a little. And the essentials are so powerful that even if that's the only thing they learn to do, it has the potential to hugely change interactions with both the child and the family. Do you want to talk a little bit about the essentials?
Of course. You know, when you speak of the essentials, the big one that just rings ding, ding, ding for me is it's awareness. I mean, that for me, it like ties everything together, and it's such an important one. And I think that's really the foundation for being able to show up in a different way, is to have that awareness, to grow that awareness, to become more conscious of ourselves and others, right? So that we can then incorporate all of those other essentials, right? Like flexible goals, moving more slowly. All of those different things can really come in when that awareness starts to increase.
Yeah. And my favorite's enthusiasm, because I feel like, as you said, feelings can't be hidden and people can smell intent a mile away. And if I feel warm and loving, which is my equivalent of enthusiasm, for the educators in my child's life, knowing that they are doing the best they can with the tools at their disposal, that just fosters a connection, right? That then allows us to do more than we otherwise could have. And hopefully that they'll use with other people.
You know what? I love that you bring that one up, because it's actually a really, really important one. And remember at the beginning, we talked a bit about that energetic presence. I think that's really what that is, that enthusiasm. And for those kids with special needs or differently able, I like to call them differently able children, they're much more sensitive. So they're going to feel someone's authenticity right away. They're going to feel that person's intention right away, you know? And so for an educator or a therapist, when you're coming towards a child, you want to make sure that you're showing up with a certain energy, that loving energy, that energy of you're beautiful and magnificent and I see you, you know, that energy of I respect you, you are safe, you are secure. I mean, all of that, to learn to show up with that kind of energy, it's a process of learning for people to understand what that truly means. But the child, yeah, exactly, right? There's a whole process. But the children, once we emanate that kind of energy, the children are right away ready. They're ready. They trust you instantly, and they're ready to learn because you're creating that. So this is one thing I would mention for educators is you want to create that environment for learning, but that requires for those children to feel safe and secure. So boundaries being respected, you know, seen, heard, valued, all those things acknowledged.
Exactly. And I would add that you probably mentioned it, but I'll mention again the essential slow. And for those who aren't familiar with the essentials, they're just the backbone of the work we do. They create the conditions in the brain for optimal learning. And one of them is slow. And so I know a lot of enthusiastic, warm, loving people who have made my children feel unsafe because they weren't using the essential slow.
Yes.
Right? It was alarming to my children. And I know they loved my children and wanted every good thing for them. But especially, I mean, if you think about it, if you are less able to act in the world for whatever reason, then you especially need people to approach you more slowly, more gently. And so I hope if any educators are listening to this, that they think, oh, yeah, if I just, you know, like on the YouTube where you can play it at half speed, go for it.
Yes. And, you know, it's great that you mentioned this because when we're approaching children, to slow that down, there's no rush, you know, and you need to ease each other into the other's energy and just really be present to them. So slowly coming near that child, maybe you take their hand, you know, there are different ways to slow that process down, even just in meeting a differently abled child, you know, allowing them to feel that, because actually slowing down really allows that space for you to be present to each of those children, for you to really emanate the energy that I was just speaking of, right? And that you were speaking of as well, that you need to slow down to be able to do that, right? I mean, slow can be, in the context of ABM, slow applies in so many different ways, but, you know, if we're speaking to how teachers are interacting with children, there's that way, but there's also just simply in what they're doing, that there doesn't have to be any rush.
And slow gives me space as a parent too, because my first impulse is to protect and defend my children. But if I slow down, I can begin to feel safer and feel that I'm not on high alert, that I need to be, you know, in protect and defend mode, which, you know, doesn't make for constructive conversations. So it also helps in talking to the educators. I, as a parent, need to slow down and remember that, as another friend of mine says, I have time.
Yes. And actually, that's great because, you know, when you say this, it's like slowing down to be more present to yourself, your feelings, your triggers that can sometimes come up in the context of a conversation with an educator, right? To be able to slow down, process our feelings, take a breath, be present to ourselves, and then engage in that conversation. So absolutely applies to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a seemingly unrelated question, but I was recently reading a quote from another author I admire that basically said, helpers are there to help, right? And that in part means having a thick skin, not in the sense of not feeling, but putting aside the need to always have your needs met first, is how I would put it. So how might you address this duality of needing to be a really present feeling person who also has the thick skin required in certain situations?
So I think this is where my personal experience has been a beautiful blessing and a gift. And I think in the context of my work, because I'm working with families of differently abled children, and I myself am part of a family with a differently abled child, in doing my own personal work, I've grown thick skin in the sense that I have become more resilient as a human being. So I think it's not so much about not being compassionate, growing a thick skin and not being compassionate, because I feel sometimes like those can be mixed a little bit, where people are so disconnected from the clients. They're so not ready to feel and engage and be present to the client that, those parents or those families will feel like, well, they're not really hearing me, or I don't feel considered, or I don't feel like my feelings are considered. So I think, and it's funny because this always comes back to everyone's individual personal work. It's really all about when you're at that place, when you're resilient, where you're strong, where you're in your power as a human being, you are so much more able to show up for families with an open heart, and not, you can still be detached in the sense that you're not enmeshed. Your own feelings are not enmeshed. Your own world is not enmeshed with what's happening with that family. But you're just much more able to hold space for these families, because they need that. They really do. These families, these children need that connection. You cannot support a child that is different, any child for that matter. You cannot support a child if you're going to show up with that disconnected, distance,
right
kind of energy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like that you put it in terms of resilience, because as another friend of mine puts it, it's just this beautiful image of when we know ourselves and are fully grounded in who we are. Resilience is like the ability to be bent over by the wind and then to just gracefully come back up. And that's what can happen, because, perhaps not with the children you work with, but some children living with special needs may exhibit behaviors that really disturb other adults. And this is where, for me, the training is so helpful, because it helps us make distinctions. And people who can't make the distinction between, well, this is a behavior, it's not an attack on me, really have difficulty separating that out. But if they're not there yet, if they have some resilience, maybe they can just let that go and bounce back. So yeah, I like that there's many different ways to approach this and to build sort of the chops we need to really be helpers. Yeah.
Yes.
What other things would you like to say to parents taking their kids back to school? What pearl do you have to share with us, if this is, unless you have something else in your back pocket you wanted to talk about?
I think we've discussed so much already in this conversation, and I think it's important for parents to process that. But I think if I was to sum everything up for parents, is that it's really, really important for parents to love themselves first, to take that time to reconnect with themselves, to open up that inner channel, to find out who they are, what their own gifts are, what their own abilities are, how they're meant to shine as a parent. This is really important, because it really opens the door for us to have the lens to see our children, to then pave the way for them. And within that, we can then advocate for our children in the school system, with their therapists, with medical practitioners, with all of these different people. And parents are so important. It's really, I have to say this because they have such a huge role in the development of that child, in that child's possibility to become who they are. But it really requires them to do that inner work, which will be an immense benefit to themselves, opening that door to a world that is limitless, truly, but also opening so many other doors for their children. We talk about possibilities within the Annette Benyal method, and that's really what it is. It's not so much looking at the limitations or seeing the world from the lens of lack, what we don't have. It's really seeing what is really possible for me, what is really possible for my kids, what is really possible for us as a family, and what is really possible within the context of this new meaning of life that we're discovering through our experience with our differently abled child. I think that if I was going to really put everything in one small something, it's that, because that is the beginning of all of these other changes.
Yeah.
It really, really is.
Yeah, it is. I agree with you. And I'm curious if this is part of what you're offering in your new projects, because you're coming out with some new tools for parents soon, yes?
Yes, I have a few things coming out. So I am writing a book, and this book is actually all about how to show up for our differently abled children. And so it really does speak to the parent's journey, and then it speaks to the child's journey and how the parent can show up. But I really focus on, in the beginning of the book, on helping the parent get to that place where they can really start to implement those other things. So helping the parent heal, and then the child. So really helping the family as a whole. So that is one of the books. And then I'm publishing a children's book. And this is very dear to my heart. And this is more about siblings. And, siblings is a whole other topic, and we won't get into it today, but this is something that's really, really important to me as well, is to help siblings also be seen, and to ensure that they're not, anyway, I'm not going to get into it. But the book itself is all about superpowers, but superpowers for both the child that is differently abled and their sibling. So together, the story is actually, the main character is the sibling. So we see how having a brother or sister that is differently abled, how that impacts that child, and how that child gets to develop all kinds of wonderful gifts and abilities as a result of having a brother or sister that is differently abled. So that book is coming out probably at the end of this year, and it's for children to raise awareness.
Yeah. I can't wait. Yeah, that's going to be so much fun. I love it. And I love how optimistic this all is, because I don't know if you've encountered this, but a realistic optimism, which I think is what you're advocating when you say helping parents really shine, find the ways that they can shine as a parent. That's realistic optimism, and it inspires us towards action, right? Whereas if we let ourselves listen to the, rational pessimism, which is what I would call what happens in a lot of clinics, schools, centers, where they give you an ultimatum, essentially, like, do not hope, because that makes us close inward and give up. So I love it that you are doing so many happy, enthusiastic, fun things without any fixed goal that put us on this road to optimism and inspired action. So thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, wonderful being here with you today.
I'm so glad. And when we're done, please go ahead and drop your links for your many projects in the comments below so people know where to reach you.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.